Sure. Thanks so much, Hannah. And yeah, thanks so much to everyone for attending. My name is June, and I'm a policy and campaigns officer at Liberty, and I lead our work on human rights frameworks, refugee rights, and freedom of expression. I'll keep my remarks relatively short because I think actually some of it was covered by Hannah, and I think it would be really, if people have any questions, please feel free to ask. But I think that from Liberty, which is a human rights and civil liberties organization based in the UK, from our standpoint, we very much see this legislation as a part of a wider trend by government in the last few years to restrict our ability to stand up for the causes that we believe in. And this is particularly stark given that the government has previously stated on multiple occasions that it is a champion of free speech. Whereas in fact, as many of you will know, we have seen successive pieces of legislation restricting the right to protest. And this latest piece of legislation, which we call the anti-boycott bill, is essentially, in our view, a kind of continuation of that, but targeting a very specific political tactic and form of political expression that, whether it's the European Court of Human Rights or UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression has acknowledged is a protected form of free expression, and of course, historically has been really significant, used by people from all across the political spectrum in all manner of, for all manner of reasons, in all kinds of different contexts, in order to try and achieve social change or to raise awareness of, what they want to raise awareness of, whether it's social injustice, international human rights abuses, or the like. I think that I'm going to go into a few of the key bits of the bill that I think Hannah has touched on, but I'll pick up again because I think some of it might have been missed in the because of tech difficulties. But I think fundamentally we have to start from first principles, and again, as I said, the right to boycott, the ability to boycott and advocate political expression, advocating boycott is a really important, time-honored, and cherished form of nonviolent protest and political expression. And I think that some of you may have already seen the legislation and looked through it, and there have been multiple kind of high-profile legal opinions that have been published recently, including one for the Labour Party. And I think there's obviously what's on the page in the bill, and then there's the wider effect. And a speaker from a previous webinar that I did with Yachad put it really well when she said, basically, we need to remember that the bill aims to suppress boycotts as a campaigning tactic. That is its aim. And, we can kind of look really deeply into the legislation about whether it will actually work. And from Monday's debate, the government has a lot of questions to answer about the practicality of and workability of the legislation. But I think on the level of the text of the legislation, from the explanatory memorandum that comes with the legislation, and the wider chilling effect that it creates by the very virtue of its existence and its passage and kind of promulgation, I guess, the effect will be to kind of silence this really key political tactic. The kind of key parts of the bill that lead us to this conclusion is obviously the kind of general ban on public bodies essentially taking into consideration or even being seen by a so-called reasonable observer as having taken into consideration a foreign state's conduct in making investment and procurement decisions. And public body in this case could be, a local council or an NHS trust or all numbers of kind of organizations that undertake public functions. And the kind of breadth of that category is so wide that the impact of this legislation is actually incredibly profound. The the general prohibition is like subject to certain exceptions, which we can talk about, but the exceptions themselves are really weak. For example, there's kind of quite vague exception that, for example, if there's a breach of international law, that could exempt a public body from the ban, but obviously that is the government acknowledging that there are certain conditions under which public bodies should be able to boycott a certain decision because it will have potential human rights implications. And I think the legislation is very circular in that way, in that its kind of design kind of explains why it's so problematic. And then obviously, as Hannah's mentioned, there's an explicit exemption that whereas the Secretary of State can designate certain countries as being exempt from the prohibition, including, it's already said, Russia and Belarus, Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, and the occupied Golan Heights are explicitly in the primary legislation as that which the minister can't exempt from the ban. And I think that it's other speakers will speak about that, but I guess it kind of again shows, I think, the fact that it's a legislation with a very specific purpose, but that actually has a much wider effect than what it has been portrayed as. I think the gagging clause is another key part. So as Hannah mentioned, it's a measure in the bill that would essentially ban public bodies from making statements, and including the individuals potentially working in those public bodies, from making statements that they intend to boycott or that they would have intended to boycott had this law not been in place. And the risk of contravening the ban, as well as this ban on political statements, is potentially a massive financial penalty, which of course, in the context of local councils, local authorities, public bodies that might fear kind of being levied with these really onerous financial penalties, will probably take quite like precautionary measures to stop people from, expressing these views. And there are also really kind of quite intrusive investigative powers created in the legislation to allow to basically find out if anyone has contravened the ban, is about to contravene the ban, which could obviously have really quite chilling effect on people's privacy and freedom of expression. I think I'll finish up by just saying that the legislation itself, like as badly worded and poorly drafted and frankly quite incoherent as it is, the effect of it is clear. It's to send a message to say that public bodies and the individuals working within them, potentially making democratic decisions within them, because, for example, local councils are democratically elected, or many of the positions within them, shouldn't be able to engage in decisions that take into consideration ethical and moral judgments. And I think that this is a really chilling path to go down, especially when you consider the kind of wider atmosphere of the clampdown on freedom of expression that's taking place for basically the kinds of speech that government doesn't like or doesn't find kind of politically expedient for them. And it's chilling not only for those particularly working on these issues, but for anyone who cares about being able to vote with your feet and to make decisions and to express your views about things that you care about. And for all of those reasons, Liberty is in solidarity with organizations opposing the legislation, and we will continue working with everyone to try and ensure and mitigate its worst harms, because in our view also, it's worth saying that we don't think it's really amendable at all, but we can do our best to try and like blunt its sharpest edges. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, June. Apologies. I hope can you all hear me now? Brilliant. Possibly also my children screaming in the background. I'm going to hand over to Yehuda. Many of you will have met Yehuda previously. He is the one of the founders and the former co-director, of Breaking the Silence, which is an organization of Israeli soldiers who have served in the occupied territories that have taken it upon themselves to try and educate the Israeli public about what goes on in the occupied territories, and with a view to that information helping to bring an end to the occupation. Today, he's the founder and co-director of an organization called Ofek, which is a, well, Yehuda could probably explain better to you, but it is a think tank that works in Israel, but also with partners all over the world to try and develop policy around bringing a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and end to the military occupation. Yehuda was brought up in Jerusalem in a Jewish Orthodox family and has spent time in a religious a yeshiva based in the West Bank, and then served in the IDF in the Second Intifada as an infantry combat soldier. And Yehuda's been a very long-standing partner and friend to Yachad, and some of you will have been probably on a bus with him at some point into the occupied territories. So Yehuda, I'm going to hand over to you to give us a kind of sense of how this looks to you as an Israeli that is seeking to kind of make political change on the ground.
Thank you, Hannah, and everyone at Yachad, and for everyone for joining us this evening. Yes, it's kind of like, we're talking about the bill in the British Parliament, but this is not this is not just a bill in the British Parliament. It's very clear this is about Israel-Palestine, and that's why I think when we come to discuss this bill, there is one thing we really need to remember, and that is the political context we are living in these days in Israel, where we have the most extremist government we've ever had in the history of this country, that is basically pursuing two major projects. One at home, full-blown illiberalism, Hungary style, destroying any remains of checks and balances and institutions that can pose any mitigation on the absolute power of the executive that they want to achieve. And in the occupied territories, acceleration of de facto and de jure annexation. And this is something that is not just something de facto, but we are moving also to the de jure level when it comes to annexation. The first guiding principle in the government guidelines basically goes like this: the Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. Yeah, in previous governments, we would have this guiding principle phrased very, very different. The Jewish people have an indisputable right to self-determination within the land of Israel. That's how it used to say. Now we have the Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel, meaning there is no Palestine, there is no room for a Palestinian state, there is no room for Palestinians, Jewish supremacy river to the sea. And that's the first principle of this Israeli government. And of course, part of the illiberal agenda in advancing annexation, we also see the government coming after civil society and especially human rights organizations who deal with rights of Palestinians in Israel and in the occupied territories. So when we talk about this kind of political context in Israel, passing a legislation like this by the UK will basically be a huge prize for the most extremist government in our country, a huge blow to the political camp, to the people here in Israel who are fighting for democratic value, and basically will strengthen this current coalition in its ideological positions. And especially the fact that this bill is very explicit and also including or shielding settlements, in the occupied territories. That basically means that the UK is joining this Israeli government policy of annexation. And I think as British citizens, as British Jews, you should ask yourself whether this is exactly the kind of position you want your government to take, and whether this is the kind of government in Israel you want to support and embolden. If I may, just two more points. I don't want to take too much time, just to leave more time for a conversation. But I think, despite of whether you agree or disagree with the BDS movement, because this bill is being framed as, we're fighting the BDS movement. I'm not a member of the BDS movement. Yeah, if anyone has any doubt on this, but it's important to keep in mind that the BDS movement is a Palestinian-led civil society movement that is fully legitimate. BDS is a nonviolent tactic, and definitely this is not a movement that is inherently anti-Semitic. And I think this kind of approach of trying to suppress the BDS movement at all costs is extremely problematic, especially politically. Yeah, I don't know. I want to live in a neighborhood where when people have disputes, they use nonviolent means to solve them rather than take guns and go to the street, especially in light of recent days in our region. And I think when we talk about BDS and the BDS movement, there is another distinction that is very, very important to make, and that is between the movement and boycott, divestment, and sanction as a tactic. One can support the use of some of these tactics and some of these measures on specific issues without being part of the movement. And again, the fact that settlements are shielded by this bill. By the way, I'm very much in favor of divesting from companies and settlements, of not, I don't even see it as something negative. I see it as something positive. It's just like, I eat kosher. Let's say I eat kosher food. I don't eat not kosher food. It doesn't mean that non-kosher food is a problem. It's just something that I don't eat because of my values and the way I view the world. Same here. Yeah, I see settlements as something extremely problematic morally and politically. And I just think that supporting settlements is a problem. And of course, this bill will prevent people like me in the UK to express their opinion and pursue their goals. The last thing I would say, just to at least put behind my intervention here, is that I think we need to, at least the way I understand this bill, and also bills as such that we've seen in the US, which probably we'll get to soon, is the way I look at it is this is part of the greater trend that we see in Israeli right and in the Israeli governments in the past few years of the move from occupation to annexation. In order to have a permanent occupation like we've been having here over Palestinians for decades, it's enough to crush Palestinian society. But in order to move to annexation, turning it one regime river to the sea, equating the reality completely, formalizing it, you also need to destroy state institutions, liberal values, and civil society in Israel, because you need to basically bring Israeli institutions to be able to swallow, the formalization of inner institutional discrimination. And I think this is the step that we've been seeing in the past few years of seeing the Israeli government turning against civil society and human rights organizations in Israel more and more. And this bill in the UK, similar bills in the US, I see as part of this trend, which is our government, the political right in Israel, is cooperating with their political and ideological allies across the globe in order to try to come and take your rights and your freedom of expression in order to shield our policy of annexation and occupation. And again, just to keep in mind and remind us, there is a reason why settlements are being protected by this law. And that's the reason. It's about shielding Israeli policy of annexation and occupation. I think I've said more than enough and want to leave it more to a conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yehuda. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions on that. Our final speaker is Suhad, who is the Executive Director of Just Vision. For those of you who don't know Just Vision, I really strongly recommend that you look up some of their work. They are a documentary storytelling organization that deal with the Israel-Palestine conflict and have made many films, of which Suhad has produced a number of them, and you're going to see a snippet of one of them now. But I would say that they have been... I'm going off piece with your bio, Suhad, but they have been some of the most useful educational tools we as Yachad have ever had, which is telling the stories of people caught up in the conflict, particularly Palestinians, and kind of being able to tell the story of the conflict through the lives of people on the ground. And actually, we have often found them to be the most useful tools in trying to get people to understand what's happening on the ground and the kind of human cost of it. And I really do recommend that you go on the Just Vision website and have a look. But Suhad is a Sundance Creative Producing Fellow. She's a global shaper with the World Economic Forum, a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she is a producer, news publisher, and, as I mentioned, the executive director of Just Vision. And in a minute, she's going to show you a clip of the film Boycotts, which Just Vision made, that Suhad produced. And one of the reasons, I guess, just to kind of put this in context, that we asked Suhad to come and speak is that the film Boycott has tracked very closely the boycott legislation in the USA that Yehuda just mentioned, and how that has been used and instrumentalized against not just issues around Israel-Palestine, but a whole host of issues, and that continues to this day, and where the legal battle has gone in the USA to try and prevent the clampdown on freedom of speech. And I think that it's a different political context, and the laws are slightly different, but there are a lot of parallels to draw, and I think most importantly, kind of lessons about where this might go, because America is certainly a number of years ahead of us in terms of legislating against boycotts. So Suhad, I'm going to hand over to you and let you introduce the film, and we'll go from there.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and such a pleasure to be with all of you today. Before we go into the trailer, just as a little bit of background for those who are newer to Just Vision's work, we are a team of filmmakers, of journalists, and of human rights advocates, and we have a laser-sharp focus on telling stories through both documentaries and journalism of Israel-Palestine. And we strive to fill a media gap by flipping the lens, really looking at the ways in which policies and practices impact communities, because we believe that actually tells a very different story than when you take a look at the top-down impact of our political apparatus, and also gives us an opportunity to look at and identify potential pressure points for change. So we've done that through documentary films, most of which, as Hannah, thank you for the very kind words, have taken place in Israel-Palestine and focus on Israelis and Palestinians who have been working to create a different future in the region for freedom, dignity, and a rights-respecting reality. We also produce a Hebrew language news site called Local Call in partnership with 972 magazine that's meant to produce analysis and in-depth investigative reporting on what's taking place on the ground today. Now, as a little bit of background for those who are familiar with our work, you may remember that our documentary films, whether Budrus or My Neighborhood or Nylon the Uprising, all feature largely Palestinian-led movements to create change, to protect families from and their livelihoods. In the case of Budrus, literally to prevent the destruction of the village because of the Israeli separation wall that was being built through it. In My Neighborhood, to protect the Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah at the heart of Jerusalem, where Israeli settlers have been violently taking over homes and the neighborhood, or Nylon the Uprising, which looks at the role of Palestinian women from the first Palestinian uprising, or the first Intifada. And through our body of work, we've been really concerned by both the role that communities play to advance change, but also the repression of those voices. So a through line that we've been paying attention to is how and why various practices by the Israeli government are being employed against voices of dissent, human rights defenders, journalists, those who are speaking out to silence the debate on Israel-Palestine. And it's because of this that we knew that as we saw anti-boycott laws take root in the United States, we really needed to expand our aperture. Boycott became the first film that we've produced with a setting in the United States. Largely recognizing that it would be an imperative, as Yehuda spoke to earlier, to draw attention to the ways in which Israeli government policies are impacting and furthering kind of an authoritarian and kind of playing into an authoritarian trends around the globe. We also knew, we're a Palestinian, Israeli, and North and South American team. We also knew that these laws were deeply problematic for what's playing out in the United States, as is the rise of kind of authoritarian-like practices and political views take deeper roots in the United States. And we knew that these laws could pose a real danger for dissent more broadly, and could quickly become a template. And so I want to go ahead and tee up this trailer so that you can go ahead and see what the film covers, and we can talk a little bit more about it afterward.
There are a number of examples of how boycotts have been used effectively, where people withhold their money, withhold their labor, withhold their time until things change. And to have a proliferation of bills that are criminalizing or penalizing that is really, really troubling and problematic.
I was just opening my annual contract from the state of Arizona, and I was rather shocked to see this.
In order to get our money, we have to pledge not to boycott Israel.
Like, what does the state of Israel have to do with Texas and elementary school?
Basically, all it says is contractor warrants he does not and will not participate in a boycott of Israel as defined by, and it gives the law number.
When people actually understand what the state is doing here, they would be absolutely horrified and appalled that would be trading away Americans' First Amendment rights so easily.
God has chosen to bless us because we protect Israel. I'm going to continue to do on a state level all that I can to support that.
I have the right to boycott anyone I want to, and the state has no business getting involved in that.
Luckily, we live in a country that they get their day in court, and we'll see what the courts decide.
You may not care about Israel-Palestine, but you should care if it's being used as a hook to legislate against free speech. How many words would I have to change in this legislation to use it to quash free speech of anyone who, say, supports Black Lives Matter or is involved in protesting for environmental reasons? And it's like 10 words. It's a template.
I regret not knowing more about the issue when I voted.
I'm looking forward for my day in court. Whenever you see injustice, regardless of what faith or gender or what's going on, you speak up. You have to say something.
So as you likely picked up from the film, in the US, there are today more than 30 states that have anti-boycott laws on the books. In the states where the anti-boycott measures have passed, many of them require public contractors to sign pledges that they will not engage in boycotts of the state of Israel. Others have created blacklists of companies and organizations that are deemed to be boycotting the state of Israel. And in yet others, there have been entire banks like Citigroup and beyond that have been sanctioned from underwriting bonds related to this law. Unfortunately, what was a very hypothetical concern around the template nature of these bills. Remember, we began following this story as early as 2015 when the first bills started to take root in the US. By the time we were wrapping up the film in 2021, unfortunately, the templates were no longer a hypothetical, but a reality. They quickly adapted the anti-boycott bills vis-a-vis Israel to extend as anti-boycott bills regarding the fossil fuels industries, similarly to prohibit individuals and companies from boycotting the firearms and weapons industries. And most recently, at the end of December of 2022, the model legislation or the templates that have been used to target boycotts of Israel, the fossil fuels and firearms industries were expanded one more time to take aim at those who are concerned with abortion access, transgender rights, workplace equity issues, and most recently, immigration and beyond. And the reason that I highlight this is because one of the things that is so important for us to understand is that when you have exceptional regressive legislation like this on the books, it quickly can transform, and it quickly does transform. You know, I think on Israel-Palestine, what allowed for these bills to pass largely was related to the culture of politics around Israel here in the United States, where you had wide bipartisan support, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party signing off and stamping these laws into legislation. Unfortunately, we've now seen the various interest groups that were around, originally allied around the anti-boycott laws, take that model legislation and adapt it to take aim at a whole number of communities and issue areas that are concerning to wide swaths of Americans. I think it's also really important to remember and hold whose interests these laws are being passed for and in. And that's why, as journalists and storytellers, we really ask the question, who has been behind these laws? How did these laws come into being? And the longer film, and I hope many of you are able to watch it in full, because there's quite a bit of background that might be useful as you're thinking about what's happening in the UK. What we came to learn is that 3 interest groups really converged around the passage of these laws. The first being the traditional Israel lobby, the second being the far right Christian fundamentalist wing through largely an organization called CUFI, Christians United for Israel. And then the third being ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the engine for the model legislation. ALEC is an organization that aligns conservative political interests with the corporate sector. And they've been known for a number of regressive laws, including the Stand Your Ground laws in the US, voting ID laws, and other efforts to silence protest and dissent more broadly. And all of this, unfortunately, has been in many ways fueled by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Through our research, we found that the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs actually set up an organization called Concert, by which they funneled money in order to fund several of the organizations in the US that had been pushing the anti-boycott laws, including teams like Christians United for Israel. And so this is something for us to be thinking about. I think one of the advantages and the rare opportunities in this case is that in the UK, the bill has not yet passed. That there's some deep ability currently to organize and really bring attention to this. One of the things we found in the US was that these laws passed quite swiftly, in our view, facilitated by and large by the lack of public scrutiny around the bills and the general culture of silencing on Israel and conversations on Israel. And so simply by speaking out and raising awareness and making sure that we're holding political leaders to account, we're seeing quite tremendous shifts in the ways in which people are organizing and paying attention to these bills here in the United States. For example, in the state of Virginia, there was recently a very powerful coalition that organized itself to effectively push back on the law's passage. And we're seeing the first repeal efforts being filed in places like Texas and continued repeal efforts across states. And so, the advantage here, and I think the message that I want to share to with all of you is that the timing is ripe, that whereby, our experience here in the States was really bringing attention to these laws after kind of a monsoon or a tidal wave of laws had passed. In the UK, it's earlier on. And so we hope to be a resource, whether that's with the film Boycott or in any of the other lessons that we've learned along the way and the research that we've been able to wrap our heads around over the last several years in following this story.
Thank you very much, Suhad. I'm keen to open it up to questions. So I think the easiest way to do this is that if you've got a question, if you can just raise your virtual hand or your physical hand, and we'll try and kind of get through as many people as possible. So I don't know if anyone has got and if you'd rather ask your question by just typing it in to the chat, please do, and then I can ask it on your behalf. So I don't know if anyone has got a kickoff question they'd like to ask. I don't believe that no one has a question. Yes, Josh. Oh,
I haven't read the full text of the bill. Has anybody taken a look at the similarity of the text of the bill with these kind of wartime legislation that you would see, for example, in the United States before they began interring Japanese people? Does this legislation, does it have echoes of these kind of To me, this is like an effort to mobilize society, right? This is part of a broader effort of mobilizing for war, where you mobilize society to kind of echo the goals of the military campaign. And this bill is kind of like testing the water to see how receptive people are to that kind of stuff before they start kind of arbitrarily throwing people in jail, obviously for ironically landing themselves on a blacklist by becoming part of a boycott movement. But is the language, is there similar language? Has anybody done any kind of comparison with this bill and other bills that are similar, dating, I hate to say it, but particularly bills in the United States during World War II?
Josh, it's a great question. I can't speak to specific legislation. We have not compared legislation across various eras. What we do recognize is that the last time that we've seen, this is comparable to McCarthy era strategies in the United States, and the kind of broad reach to silence dissent and force alignment with government policies. I think the broader trend toward authoritarianism is the deep concern that we're paying attention to here in the U.S. And I think it isn't surprising that it's happening in lockstep with the Israeli government's continued and very quick rise to the extreme right wing. The other piece that I would just want to note for this conversation is that one of the pieces that is also really important to kind of hold and be paying attention to is that in the US, the laws were originally framed as anti-discrimination measures to protect in the name of protecting Jewish communities. In places like Arkansas, the irony being that the very legislator that drafted and put forward the bill refused to consult with the largest Jewish community and the head rabbi in Arkansas because he opposed the bill, right? And the reason that I bring this up is that, the bills now are being used, they continue to be used and framed as anti-discrimination measures. So it's protecting against economic discrimination of the fossil fuels industry, protecting against economic discrimination of the firearms industry, and really utilizing these efforts to shield accountability of corporate interests, political interests, and interest groups that are really damaging to our democracy writ large.
June, I don't know if you want to just kind of come in there and talk about it in a UK context, because obviously there are other pieces of legislation that Liberty is involved in kind of lobbying around, that might be relevant.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that obviously, as the other speakers have so clearly set out, it's a very specific, in many ways, I think even in the debate, many parliamentarians pointed out that it's like an incredibly wide piece of legislation designed to target a very specific situation and to drive a wedge before. I guess the other context is that we're about to have a general election in the next year, and it's designed to kind of create those to trip the opposition up, I guess, or even just to kind of make it just to kind of force a debate on a piece of legislation that frankly it's just unclear where it's coming from, who wants it when you have a cost of living crisis that's dominating everyone's minds. But I think this is a similar trend that we've seen with, again, kind of the other part of what my main work is at Liberty, which is to kind of resist the government's clampdown on free expression through the right to protest. And whether that's the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act of 2021 or the Public Order Act, 2022, and then the Public Order Act of this year, the government's narrative is very much to target a very particular group, in those cases, Just Stop Oil, Insular Britain, regardless of what you think of those groups' tactics, and we may well disagree with them. the impact of those pieces of legislation, both in terms of the actual text of the legislation, in terms of the breadth of criminal offenses it creates on protest, and the creation of stop and search powers, as well as the kind of broader chilling effect it creates to kind of create the sense that protest is banned, or effectively like if you protest, you'll get into trouble. It kind of, I feel like the logic is quite similar in that it's a message. It's trying to send a message, in this case, to public bodies, to individuals within them, that don't engage in these tactics, don't exercise your right to free expression, don't engage in this fundamental civil liberty that is the foundation of any healthy and functioning democracy, which is why it's so important. It's just basically saying don't do any of those things. And we really have to question kind of in whose interests is it actually to centralize power in this way and to kind of remove power from, for example, local councillors or local government to make these decisions on whatever issue or whatever country or human rights abuses or whatever environmental destruction they're trying to target with their tactics. So yeah, I think there are like a lot of resonances, I think, between our contexts in quite a like terrifying way.
John has got a question. Thank you for that answer, by the way.
Thanks, Hannah. My question is really about the political prospects of the bill. So really, it's past the first reading, but what do you think is actually going to happen next in committee, in the Lords, in subsequent Commons votes? Because the total numbers of MPs who actually voted was relatively low, several hundred people away, lots of abstentions, and there's certainly been reports that a substantial minority of Conservative MPs are against it. Do you think Labour will ultimately come out against it? And do you think there is actually a prospect of it being defeated? Or would the government even proceed if they thought that was a prospect?
So I'll tackle that one, and June might also have some kind of info on it. So where we're basically at, so it passed second reading, mainly because because there were so many abstentions. What now has to happen to it, and June may have a slightly better handle than me on the exact order of parliamentary process, but before it goes back to the Commons to be given its final vote and get kind of sent and become a law, it's got to go to committee stage where there are opportunities for amendments, and then it's got to go to the Lords, and it can end up in what is called ping pong, where the Lords say we don't like this bit, we're amending it, and you send it back to the Commons, and the Commons can say, well, we're putting it back in, and it can go backwards and forwards. And the Lords often use that tactic to try and, they can't ultimately override the Commons, but they can make it very embarrassing for the government and get some concessions, and also slow down the passage of the bill. My understanding is that Labour's current position, and obviously whatever Labour does doesn't numerically stack up, that even if the entirety of the Labour Party was whipped to vote against it, the bill would still pass if the Tories were whipped to vote for it. My understanding is that there would have to be very significant amendments for Labour to vote for it at third reading, and that they have basically said we will vote. They have said, I mean, they said this in the Commons debate on Monday, that they will vote against the bill at third reading unless there are significant changes to it. It's not quite clear. They haven't actually kind of detailed what those changes would need to be to give it support. And my sense is that this bill is so problematic that it's almost impossible to amend it into something which would be okay, for all the reasons that we've discussed. And there is definitely the expectation that the Lords are going to really not like it, which means that you will get lots and lots of pushback in the House of Lords and lots of laws from across, from both sides of the House that really kind of take this to task. And actually the benefit, one of the pluses of the Lords is that they're not beholden to the whip in the same way that the Commons are. So you can get many more Tories that are much more vocally opposed to it in the Lords than you would in the Commons. That the flip of that is that they have no kind of capacity to do anything. They have no staff. So it comes down to whether a lord is is interested in the bill enough to kind of get stuck in and prepared to kind of put the time in, unlike in the Commons where they can get their kind of teams and their researchers to do the work for them. So I think there is a chance that it's definitely the case, I should just add, that that the expectation on Michael Gove's part was that this was going to be a very easy thing to get through Parliament, and it's been made very clear that it's absolutely not. And so there is a chance that they could try and bury it because it's too embarrassing. And so they could turn around and say, well, it's going to committee and it's being amended and it goes to the Lords and it comes back. And oh, unfortunately, it's now the general election in October 2024 and it's too late. And so I think that if there is enough dissent and enough concern, that they might well try and just kind of make it go away. Because if there is an election next October, Parliament won't ever really come back after the summer recess, which gives the bill now a year to get through Parliament, which is quite long, but they can also slow down the passage of it substantially, that it takes over a year. So it's not clear. I think if it does end up going to a vote, the question will be how many Tories are prepared to defect, because it will be a whipped vote. And I haven't done the exact maths, I'm sure someone else has, but I think you'd need over 50 Tories to vote against it, which is that's a very high defection rate, because even with Labour and the Scottish National Party, the number's still there. You need at least 50. I think it's probably more than that. And so I'm not sure if it came down to getting that far, you'd get 50 defectors, 50 plus defectors. That's a big rebellion on actually quite a random piece of legislation that doesn't actually affect. I mean, the thing about this, as June said, is that it doesn't actually affect the average voter. It's completely irrelevant to the average person who's worrying about how to pay their heating bill and how they're going to feed their kids. And so this is not a vote winner for MPs. But June, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think you basically covered it. I think what I would say is that for those who would be interested in taking action, I think that basically the debate showed that the government is very weak on this. I would say that they're weak in terms of their justification on a lot of pieces of legislation, but in this, it was quite their kind of logic for it kind of fell apart in real time. And I think as far as possible, if people in the call and those listening or whoever are in a position to write to their MP to speak about why you oppose it, if you oppose it, or if you have questions about it, I think it could be really powerful, because precisely the government is on unstable footing with it. It doesn't really have the public on side. As far as I know, this is not something that the public in general is very concerned about. And I think that our organizations have briefings that you can send and can use them to ask for a meeting and just kind of lobby them. And because also realistically with the parliamentary process as it is, with the majority as it stands, it's either that the government concedes and amends the bill, or doesn't progress it and delays it and it doesn't pass, or that's basically the only way that it will be changed, just because we've seen many pieces of legislation where it goes through the parliamentary process only to be back where it started because of the parliamentary majority. So the power really lies in MPs, but the benefit of that is that they're elected. So if you have any relationship with your MP or you want to do something about that, I'm sure Yachad and others ourselves would be happy to support you to raise those issues.
Thank you. Liz, I know you've got a question, then I can see after Liz, Jonathan's also got one.
Hear me?
Yes, can now.
Right. I'm sure these are very naive questions because I'm really not totally au fait with this issue. My first is, would the British government be able to be trying to pass this legislation if we were still part of the EU? Secondly, if it is passed, is what is the probability that it'll be tested in the courts? And thirdly, and rather disconnected from this, so you may not want to address it, I understand that in Israel at the moment, there is a move to further punish through taxation foreign, I don't know, governments or organizations that want to fund, help finance Israeli NGOs. I've heard this briefly in the context of Wahat Salam Neve Shalom, but I know no more than that. So those are my three possibly extremely naive questions.
No, they're not naive at all. On the EU piece, I had to say I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that France and Germany have passed. Suhad, you might actually know. I know that France and Germany have passed versions of anti-boycott legislation. So my hunch is it wouldn't make a difference, kind of in the big picture. But I don't know if you have you got that info.
That's generally right, Hannah. And I think the piece to be paying attention to is that efforts to pass laws that are meant to silence critique of Israeli policy are being pushed across European states right now. So they're passed certainly in Germany. You have also IRA legislation that's moving. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism that is being pushed currently, that conflates critique of Israeli policy with anti-Semitism. And so this is a broader trend, Liz, that's happening certainly across European states that we're paying attention to.
The one bit of the legislation that possibly might be an issue from at an EU level would be the clause about Israel, the OPTs and the Golan Heights. I don't know whether there are certain EU positions on that, and that may have been an issue, but I think broadly the bill would still be going through. On the question of the courts, June, I don't know if you want to come in here.
Yeah, I mean, we're not thinking of legal action yet, but I'm sure so many people have been I'm sure someone out there, it's not a naive question at all. I think it's just who is in the best position to challenge it in the courts, but obviously that also creates that danger whereby the government could say, oh, judges, enemies of the people, like kind of take that line, which is also quite worrying. But I would definitely expect that someone will try and challenge it in the courts if it does come to pass. But obviously, yeah, we should try our best to not get to that point, because we might not, the courts may not strike it down because it's something that Parliament passed. So
just to add to that, there was a piece of legal advice given to the Labour Party from a KC called Richard Hermer, which is now kind of being published, which we can circulate. And he is certainly of the view that there could be a challenge in the courts on this in numerous directions, but he raised particularly the issue around there is an exclusion at the end of the legislation around international legal obligations, and he thinks it's highly likely you could end up in a court where someone says, well, actually the UK has an international legal obligation to end the occupation by divesting from the occupied Palestinian territories, and therefore we are not fulfilling our international legal obligations, and therefore we have a right. We are not excluded from a divestment from the occupied Palestinian territories, which would then render the specific bit of the bill related to the occupied territories as illegal. So there are also questions around whether it breaches freedom of expression. The UK government is beholden to. So I think there will be challenges in court. And even if once it's passed, it will be challenged, definitely. Yehuda, do you want to answer quickly Liz's question about the NGO legislation in Israel? Which is not just what you want to do.
It's what's up?
No, I just was saying it's a different side of the same coin, basically.
Yeah. It's part of the clampdown on freedom of expression here in Israel. But basically, it's part of the coalition agreement, and there was a legislation tabled by a member of Knesset from the Likud basically the idea is to tax. The original bill was to tax 60% any donation from foreign government entities to NGOs in Israel who, in a way, deal with human rights, civil rights issues that the government doesn't like. I'm simplifying things. It was written in a bit of a, people who do political work, trying to convince public opinion. Forget about how it was written. Basically, the idea was human rights organizations that deal with issues that the government doesn't like, Palestinian rights, asylum seekers, etc., will get 60% tax on foreign government donations. It was already submitted to discussion in the ministerial committee, but a serious intervention from Germany, US, and other states around basically got it off for now. And now we see an attempt of trying to bring a kind of like a bit of a different version, but more or less the same family bill for taxing 50%. But this is really a continuous attempt. The thing is that this will basically have enormous, tremendous impact on civil society in Israel. By the way, not only the organizations that they're trying to target. If the bills will pass the way they were written, it will shut down huge segments of Israeli civil society on many issues, not only in Israel-Palestine. But I'm sure that as they're going to advance, if and when they will advance the legislation, they will reward, the laws, the bills, to target only or to center only on the organizations they don't like, which is human rights organizations who deal with Palestinian rights, asylum seekers, etc. So this is definitely here, trying to shut down with economic war, kind of.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're going to take Jonathan's question, and then I think that if someone else has got a burning question, let me know. But after that, I think we might try and draw things to a close. Oh, I think you've gone back on mute somehow. There you go.
Yeah, as I understand it, yesterday there was the opposition put forward an amendment to the legislation that was defeated. But what was the effect of that? I mean, or what would have been the effect of that amendment?
So June, do you want to take that before I jump in?
Yeah, sure. So Labour put down a reasoned amendment to basically decline to give the bill a second reading, which means that basically they oppose the bill. So Labour whipped to vote in support of that reasoned amendment, but that failed. And then afterwards, when they had the kind of full vote on the entire bill, both are full votes, but basically Labour, I would say, it's something we were kind of trying to figure out within civil society, but I guess the kind of idea is that in the vote that mattered, I guess the material vote, they whipped to abstain. So it's kind of I would say it's kind of a symbolic statement of opposition to the bill, but kind of not carrying through actually voting against it, if that makes sense. If it sounds confusing, it's because it's a bit confusing. It's a bit confusing for us because I guess if they opposed it, then they, I guess, logically should have not whipped to abstain, but they have their reasons. I don't know how to.
I guess just to add that what they what their amendment basically said was that this bill is so rubbish, it's not worthy of a second reading. And the way we would amend it is to basically to amend procurement legislation to say that public bodies should have I don't know, I can't remember the exact wording, but words to the effect of an ethical procurement policy, which is applied kind of across the board. So, you know, as long as you have an ethical procurement policy and you're not singling out a specific country and how you apply it, it's absolutely fine to take a political or moral decision with your financial with your financial dealings. And that was their way of saying that basically, you know, it's ridiculous to create a situation where you can't do it at all, and that rather than you know, to prevent the singling out, for example, a public authority singling out Israel for boycott or divestment, have an ethical policy with your procurement, and that way you will apply it across the board, and that would be the way to deal with this problem, not this piece of legislation. So the amendment fell, as Jun said. So that is now not relevant because it didn't pass. So the Tories, I know, were whipped to vote against the amendment, which is why many more abstained from the vote on the actual bill than they did on the amendment. So it's a bit of, as Jun says, kind of parliamentary kind of hoop jumping, basically. It was, and the reason, my understanding is the reason that Labour didn't want to oppose the bill outright was because they share the premise, which is that there are times in which BDS against Israel, and by extension the OPTs, is used to whip up hatred against the Jewish community, and that is a problem that needs dealing with. They just think they have a better way to deal with the problem, which is through what they suggested in their amendments, basically. So it was a way for them to say, we don't disagree with it. Them not voting against it was a way for Labour to say, look, we don't disagree with the problem you're trying to solve. We think you're solving it in an incorrect way, basically. But that now is kind of toast, basically, because it got voted down. I think I'm just conscious that people probably are hungry and, you know, have got to the end of their attention kind of span for the evening. So I think we should draw it to a close. But I guess I would just end by saying two things, which is firstly, we've live streamed this and there is a recording of it. And I know that a lot of people have said that they want to see the recording. And so if there's people you're talking to who are interested, please do share it with them. We'll circulate the link, and we can also circulate all the stuff that was in the chats to you kind of over the next day or two. And I guess just to say that the more voices that are very vocal against this legislation, the easier it becomes for more people to be vocal. And we've seen that even in the last few weeks. So for example, I don't know if people saw, and it is worth reading if you haven't read it, Jonathan Friedland's piece in the Jewish Chronicle a couple of weeks ago, where he was very clear about his opposition to this. And that gave real permission to quite a few MPs to stand up in the House of Commons and say, you know, I've read Jonathan Friedland's piece and I agree with what he's written. And so the more that this is talked about and the more kind of space it creates for people to express their opposition to it, and the more political breathing space we then create in this country to kind of, when this comes back into Parliament. So I would really encourage you to talk to other people about it, to write to your MPs, as Jun said, and to circulate the recording of tonight's webinar, because I think that there is the way this legislation has been kind of pitched in the public domain, and actually I think I've now got rid of it, but I had Michael Gove's quote up before, is that this is about, you know, you're either against anti-Semitism, in which case you're for this bill, and if you're not for this bill, then you are in support of anti-Semitism, is the narrative that actually only the Jewish community can kind of turn on its head. And it has been set up as a kind of wedge issue to kind of, I think, separate the Jewish community from the rest of civil society and put us on one side of a piece of very anti-democratic legislation. And it's kind of incumbent on us to push back and say that actually that's not where we sit politically, and we don't agree with that analysis and with that framing. So please do speak out about it. If you've got questions, be in touch with us. I know Suhad and I think the Just Vision team kind of mentioned in the live stream that there are opportunities to watch Boycott and to also have screenings of it, and we can definitely help connect you to Just Vision to do that. But it is, Suhad, it's on quite a lot of platforms already for home viewing, isn't it?
That's right. The film is streaming on Amazon, Google Play, Vimeo on Demand, and beyond. So please do check it out if you want to share it with others. And Hannah, we will make a link available for this group specifically to watch the film for free, so without the paywalls that these other platforms have. So we're happy to do that and to work with you and your team to make sure that it's available if folks are compelled and moved to use it in sharing with their friends and networks at home or screening in their communities, as this is all playing out in the UK and is a live conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.